welcome to Synthesizer Reviews. This is our first video for the Moog Unit format, 2 units wide East Coast traditional VCO. Today we're looking at 3 excellent oscillators that meet those requirements. They are all 2 units wide. They are all traditional East Coast analog oscillators, and they all share a .com power header, which means they'll be plug and play for most of you. The first thing that we can talk about right off the bat is build quality. They're all similar in build quality, but different in build type. The acVCO by Analog Craftsman is a hand-built, hand-wired oscillator. It's on a silk-screened panel, much like the synthesizers.com Q106 oscillator is. And then the third oscillator is the Corsynth Odyssey of Sound C104. It's on an etched panel. Some people prefer etched panels. Some people don't care. Some people criticize silkscreen panels, that they're too delicate, that they'll chip or scratch off. I've never had that happen, and I understand that it is a more cost-effective method to do. It can be done in-house by a lot of module makers, whereas most people aren't photo etching their own panels. I will give extra points to Analog Craftsman because they take the time and energy to silkscreen 2 colors onto all of their panels. That little bit of orange will probably upset some anal retentive Moog format purists that think all the panels need to be black and white. But that little bit of orange I think is pretty awesome, and that's not an easy thing to do. You have to worry about registration, and it makes the panel making process twice as difficult. But they do it just to be a little bit different, and I think that's awesome. When you're buying modules, price and value are not necessarily equal in terms of playing field. I look at price obviously as, dollars and cents, but value to me has a lot more to do with panel density and feature density. If you have a 2 unit wide module that's inexpensive, but it doesn't do very much, that's to me pretty low value, because we're all working within the confines of our cabinet, and you have to worry about, is this an efficient use of space? If something is not an efficient use of space, or is going to require a lot of external modules to get it to do what you want it to do, then I would say that is not a particularly good value. It may be priced reasonably, but value and price in terms of modular, I think, are different things. Taking a closer look, now that we have all of our oscillators in tune, so there's some comparisons to be made between the 3 right at the top of the module. The Q106 has a fine-tuned frequency adjustment and an octave switcher, a range switch. This is commonly found on, most semi-modular or normalized synths like the Voyager Sub 37, that sort of thing. Whereas the Analog Craftsman and the Odyssey of Sound both have coarse tuning and fine tuning rather than having a range switch. With the exception of the Odyssey of Sound does provide a -1, +1 3-way toggle to kind of bridge that gap a little bit. If you were using either of these 2, planning on using either of these 2 for a live usage, that would be fine. because jumping octaves is quick and easy, whereas this Analog Craftsman, it would be a little bit more complicated. You know, you'd have to break out the tuner pretty regularly, so it's just something to consider. Let's take a look at the waveforms. We'll start with the saw wave of the Odyssey of Sound, and we will go from there. Here is the Q106. And the Analog Craftsman. You may or may not be able to hear, depending on how you're viewing this, it sounds like there is a little bit of a low frequency bleed through. If you listen there on that Analog Craftsman, there is, I haven't tested to see if it appears on the other waveforms or if it's just the saw wave. It just, I think, part of the characteristic of it, that the presence of that lower harmonic. Let's take a listen to some of the other waveforms. We'll start with the sine waves. Okay, here is the Odyssey of Sound. Here is the Q106. And here is the Analog Craftsman. One thing that you will have noticed is that the sine wave output of the acVCO is approximately 1 octave lower than the saw wave output. That relates to the skew compound waveform, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Here is the triangle wave of the Odyssey of Sound. Here's the triangle on the Q106. And here's the Analog Craftsman. Again, an octave down. Let's take a listen to our pulse wave. Okay, so for this, I'm going to set our pulse width to 12 o'clock on all three, and we will kind of address pulse width modulation separately. So here's just the pulse wave at 50%. That was the Corsynth Odyssey of Sound. Here's the Q106. And the Analog Craftsman. Okay, so I think for now we're done with the oscilloscope. Let's take a break and take a look at some of the things that, other features that make these oscillators unique. Okay, so we've already addressed the difference in the tuning sections in the three oscillators. Now, let's kind of talk about what makes each one of these oscillator is useful for specific things that are not necessarily shared common traits. The Odyssey of Sound has a couple of extra features that I haven't seen on any other oscillator. For one, it has this section here, which is a diode signal clipping function that can either be used on the saw wave or triangle wave, and it is also voltage controllable. So you can send a sequencer or an LFO or keyboard tracking if you wanted to. Here, you can attenuate it here, and you will get a kind of almost wave folding out of it. We will take a listen to that and see what kind of things you can do with that. Also, it has a built-in ring modulator. You have one ring modulator input. The other input is normaled to the pulse, and it is affected by pulse width modulation. One of the reasons why that's interesting is if you were to use the diode clipping output back into the ring modulator input, and you had an LFO going to your soft clip, and you had another LFO going to your pulse width, you could get a constantly evolving, pretty complex waveform out of one oscillator, which that might not be something that you're going to do every day, but the fact that you can get that unique of a sound and that diverse of a sound out of one oscillator and an LFO or two LFOs or a couple lanes in your sequencer, that is a pretty, to me, tremendous feature. It is sacrificing the fact that you don't get linear and exponential frequency modulation, because there's only so much room in a panel. But if you don't do a ton of frequency modulation, but you like kind of abstract, non-geometric waveforms, this has a lot to offer. Granted, you can accomplish very similar things using either of these other two oscillators and some additional modules. But the fact that you can do all of that in one is tremendously useful. Some benefits of the Q106 is, like we discussed earlier, it does have a range switch. It has both linear and exponential frequency modulation with attenuation for both. It also has a ramp wave out, which the other two don't. The Q106, I think, kind of gets maybe a bad reputation as being unimaginative, maybe. It seems like it's the first oscillator that a lot of people get, or people don't give it enough street cred because they're so readily available that something that's that mass-produced can't be great. Whether you like the sounds that it makes or not, you can't argue with the fact that it is a really well laid out, well-functioning oscillator. And if you look at the PCB and the PCB layout, you can, without making permanent modifications to the panel, you can tweak the way it's working a little bit and kind of customize it to your needs. For instance, you could convert either the linear frequency modulation or the exponential frequency modulation to operate as a soft sync by moving the way the pots and jacks are plugged in on the circuit board on the back. The jumpered volt per octave inputs, being able to daisy chain oscillators together is nice because you don't have to use a mult. I have done it pretty extensively and not had a noticeable voltage drop that would cause pitch issues, as opposed to using an external buffered mult. Where the acVCO really shines to me is two things. The fact that your linear and exponential frequency modulation inputs can either be AC coupled or DC coupled. Neither of the other two oscillators offer that function, either on the front panel or via jumper on the back, at least as far as I can tell. And I never really thought about until I started experimenting with this oscillator how AC coupling versus DC coupling affected frequency modulation, but it's actually pretty noticeable. They all have, all three of them, the oscillators have attenuation for pulse width modulation. They all have a sync input, at least one. And another kind of added feature of the Analog Craftsman is it has this skew output, which is connected to this waveform output. It is a combination of triangle and saw wave. And we'll look at what that looks like on the oscillator and oscilloscope in just a second. That, to me, kind of falls back into the category of these features here, whereas they are, they kind of get extra bonus points for being able to do these complex functions internally, as opposed to having to use a mixer to mix those two waveforms together, or a wave folder. The fact that you can do it kind of in-house with fewer modules, fewer power connections, that's a bonus for me. Let's take a look at a couple of these specific features on the oscilloscope, and we can make some judgments from there. One thing that we're going to be doing here is I'm going to be using a Suit and Tie Guy Studios mixer to be mixing a couple of the outputs on the Q106 to try and emulate what's happening with the diode clipping and what's happening with the skew on this one, because, well, like I said, they can be done internally. It's nice to be able to know that you can mimic those, if not duplicate them exactly, using this oscillator. So let's take a look at some of these specific features on the oscilloscope and see what we can come up with. So we will start with the internal diode clipping on the Corsynth using a triangle wave, which is, let's see if we can take a look. Now we're going to see if we can replicate that using the saw wave output and the Suit and Tie Guy mixer. So we're going to start with the volume on the mixer at noon, and then we're going to go up to around 3 o'clock, which is where we usually see diode clipping, assuming that your STG mixer is tuned to stock settings. Okay, let's compare the two. Back to the Corsynth. And back to the Suit and Tie Guy folded sort of saw wave. Okay, so they are similar, not exactly the same. The Corsynth clips the triangle wave almost to a square, whereas the suit and tie guy kind of distorting the saw wave out of the Q106 doesn't quite get there. Maybe if you mixed the saw wave and a square wave and used a little bit of the clipping in the mixer, you could get closer. But from just a basic standpoint, it's not quite the same. Let's take a look at the triangle wave and see if we have the same result. So here's the triangle wave clipped internally with the C104. Okay, let's try triangle wave. Same thing with the Q106 and the STG mixer. Okay, again, that produces the same kind of consensus that it gets close, not the same. And the fact that the Odyssey of Sound provides that clipping with voltage control, and the benefit that it is not gain dependent, as you can see. The fact that it doesn't have such a tremendous change in gain like using the STG mixer would have to get the clipping, I think that is obviously an added benefit. Let's take a look now at the skew output of the Analog Craftsman and see if we can see how that can be used. So back to Analog Craftsman. We are at skew. I'm going to set the skew right at noon so we can take a look. Okay, so like I said, that's a mixture of the two waveforms. The skew knob acts almost like a crossfader between the two, because you'll have, as one reaches 100%, the other is going to reach 0, as opposed to mixing two waveforms, two separate outputs using the mixer at the same volume. You'll have maybe a more complex waveform. A thing to note that we can look at is, since we determined that the saw wave of the Analog Craftsman is an octave up, let's see how that's affecting the skew output. Okay, so we hear the two intervals when the skew knob is set to 50% or noon, which makes me believe that the saw wave has a higher range output than the other waves, intentionally to provide that interval when you're using the skew output. If that's the case, that actually makes sense, because that means that you're mixing. If you wouldn't really be able to accomplish that same sound if they had the same range output, you'd have to use something like the Corsynth frequency divider multiplier to offset that octave if you were going to try and accomplish this using only one oscillator, and you'd still have to use a mixer. So the more that I think about it, the more it makes sense that the saw wave output is an octave higher. I think we're just about finished with the oscilloscope for now. So let's take a look at some frequency modulation and some pulse width modulation. Okay, so here is the pulse width of the Corsynth, and there's something really interesting about it. Okay, what you may notice is that at no point at either end of the spectrum do we actually lose audio range. This is limited internally to from like 10% to 90% versus 0 to 100%, which means that you'll never have the audio drop out, which is actually kind of awesome. Let's take a look at the Q106 and I'll show you what I mean. Do you hear how it drops out? But one thing to note is that it doesn't drop out, it fades out. If you listen and look at the scope. It fades out and fades in at the ends of the spectrum with a kind of a bell curve. It's an exponential fade out. Whereas the pulse width on the AC doesn't do that. You hear it drop out completely all of a sudden? Okay, so I talked to Tony at Analog Craftsman about that, and that's to see if maybe we could swap out to a different style of potentiometer, whether it's an audio taper or logarithmic taper, or if there's anything that could be done, and he said no. That being said, not a deal breaker. It's just something that you would have to spend time and know where you could set, what your range is. If you're using, say, a sequencer, a voltage sequencer, to modulate your pulse width, you could just manually kind of tune what your highest and lowest voltage points are to keep all of your modulation in that audio range. Or if you you can use the attenuator to just kind of compress that voltage range to keep it all in play. The only reason why I mention that is because if you were using this in a live situation or you're live patching this, that could be a point of frustration if you were not prepared for it ahead of time. Let's try some pulse width mod using the Quad LFO by SSL. I'm going to be attenuating it externally so we can see, and I'm going to have the attenuators all the way up on all of the inputs so we can see exactly what that means, as opposed to attenuating it here, to see how the same waveform is affecting each the same amplitude waveform is affecting each one, I think helps visualize just how useful that 90-10 limiting is on the pulse width. So this is the SSL quad LFO, just a basic free running LFO running through an attenuverter chiclet that Low Gain Electronics wired up for me. Thanks to Logan for that. Okay, let's take the same modulation into the QN06. Okay, as to be expected. Let's see what it does in the Analog Craftsman. So as you can hear, it's cutting out abruptly. To solve that, obviously you just attenuate the voltage, but the fact that we have to attenuate that voltage for this input where we didn't with either of the other two oscillators, just to me is a point that needs to be made. The pulse width input and the pulse width modulation on this is going to behave differently. We will look now at some frequency modulation using the same LFO and the same amplitude attenuated by that chiclet. Okay, so we'll take our modulation input. We'll do exponential mod on, since we only have exponential modulation on the Corsynth VCO, we will start there. So some subtle vibrato. Okay, as to be expected, I imagine this is going to sound the same. We're still on square waves, still center width on everything. Okay, now let's try that same wave going into the Analog Craftsman. We are currently set to DC coupled on that input. And now we'll switch to AC coupled. Okay, let's try that with linear frequency modulation. Obviously, we can't check the Corsynth because it doesn't offer linear frequency modulation. DC coupled on the Analog Craftsman as well. AC coupled. Back to DC. So, having the AC-DC switch on the modulation inputs on the acVCO is tremendously useful to do that. To accomplish that goal in other ways, you would have to use maybe one of the .com mixers and configure it on the PCB to be either AC coupled or DC coupled. And of course you could hack it and wire a switch to flip back and forth between the two. So to get that functionality, and I'm trying to think if there's any other way that you could do that without going to that much trouble, and I don't know that there is. So to get that functionality, you would have to come up with a pretty elaborate workaround. So having that switch and that functionality, like I said, is tremendously useful if you do a lot of frequency modulation. I personally don't do a lot of frequency modulation. It just is not something that I use a lot in the music that I make. But I know that there are some people that use it on everything. So in my unbiased opinion, that is useful. So let's now take a look at the let's see what we can come up with using the built-in ring modulator in the Corsynth VCO. So for that, we're going to use the ring modulator output. And here we are. So that is just a basic square wave because that's what's normaled to one of the two inputs. So let's take, like I said, the soft clipping output into ring mod input. So we're going to be ring modulating the diode clipped triangle wave with the pulse width square wave. No. Here's the triangle wave, I'm sorry, the saw wave. So like I said, having that kind of complex functionality all contained within the module is very useful. Let's take two voltage outputs of a Moon 569 free running, just to see what we can do. So I'm going to turn the attenuators, well, that's actually not an attenuator for the control voltage on the soft clipping, but it is for the pulse width. So let's just Turn that on. So now we're just going to be feeding some random voltages into those. Okay, so like I said, having some modulation on both of those waves produces some pretty interesting, and depending on how you use it, useful waveform, all contained within the Corsynth. How you use it and how frequently you use that type of feature, obviously your mileage may vary, will vary for sure, but the fact that it can do it is pretty useful. Granted, if you already have a ring modulator in your system, then that's not as useful. I personally don't own a ring modulator, so being able to have that flavor at my disposal is kind of an added bonus. When Pablo at Corsynth volunteered to send me that module, I didn't even know that it had a ring modulator. I kind of assumed that it was just going to be another version of a Q106 because their layout was so similar, but their layout is both kind of loosely based on the Moog 921B oscillator. I wouldn't say either of them is an emulation of that oscillator, but certainly they used it as a roadmap. And so I think their similarities probably end at the cosmetics. So let's now take a look at the way these oscillators sync. And for that, I will be using an extra Q106 oscillator off camera that will be my oscillator 1, and then each of these will sync to it. So for that, I will be using the Suit and Tie Guy mixer to mix the two oscillators. I'm going to leave all of the inputs at noon so we're not getting any extra clipping, and we will go from there. So let me reset for that and we'll take a look. Okay, we are now all set up to sync. So our signal path for this exercise is we have, like I said, an off-camera Q106 that we are feeding the pulse width out of that into the sync inputs on everything else. We are going to be listening to the saw waves of each of those outputs. So you'll always be hearing two oscillators, the kind of master Q106 and then each of our three specimen. We're getting gate voltage out of the Voyager XL keyboard also that is going into the SSL VC ADSR just to give us a little bit of consistency. And we're using mults in to distribute the pitch voltage from the keyboard to all four oscillators at once. That way so we're not daisy chaining from one manufacturer to another in case there are any variables in that. So we will be doing a little bit of frequency fine tuning in our sync. And so we will start with the Q106 master and the Odyssey of Sound synced to it. Okay, let's try the Q106 synced to the slave to the Q106. Okay, and now the Q106 and the acVCO. Okay, so off the bat, listening to those three synced to the Q106, we notice that the two oscillators that have coarse tune knobs instead of a range switch produce more dramatic sync opportunities. That makes sense. The greater you can shift the pitch on the synced oscillator, the more of that sync sweep you're going to get. So comparing the acVCO and the Corsynth Odyssey of Sound, I think to my ears, the acVCO has kind of a nicer sync tone. I don't generally do a lot of sync in modular because I have lots of other synthesizers that do that sound. And so I usually use my modular to make things that they can't. But if you are all about the sync, specifically hard sync, I think the acVCO is kind of a must-have. To my ears, that sync is pretty unique. It's very smooth. And I can imagine that if you had more than one of them, if you were syncing one of these off of another one versus what we're doing with the Q106, that would be even more dramatic because the kind of the sonic signature of the oscillator would be more prevalent in your synced sound. To recap, the Q106 by synthesizers.com is kind of a great standard oscillator. It provides you a little bit of everything you need and a lot of flexibility. Kind of the cons for a lot of people do not like the range switch because you can't really sweep the frequency of the oscillator. This is only going to give you really plus or minus about not even really a fifth. So if you're manually tuning your oscillators to sweep, that's not really going to get you there. The Corsynth and the acVCO are going to be much more dramatic in that sense, at the sacrifice of not having the range switch, which means, for live purposes, if you're reconfiguring your system, manually retuning your VCOs on the fly is going to be a pain. This does provide the happy medium of having a plus and minus and a zero three-way switch on the octave selector. So if you were so inclined, you could kind of dedicate each one of your C104s to a specific range, and then just kind of jump back and forth between the two. The C104 limits the pulse width mod from 10% to 90%, which means you're never going to lose audio. I know some people will intentionally set their pulse width to either 100% or 0% to get a either +5 or -5 fixed voltage out of their Q106, and that is a cool trick. There are other ways to get a +5 or -5 fixed voltage. I wouldn't go out of my way to buy a Q106 just to have that kind of hidden functionality, but if you already own one and you need that and you're not using that oscillator for audio purposes, you can do that. The acVCO is going to give you the added functionality of the skew output, the AC-DC coupling on your frequency modulation inputs, but at the same time you're going to have to remember, if you're playing in a live situation, that you're going to have to modulate carefully with your pulse width.